¿No lo trabajaron? No.
They have to miss work to be here.
Now, are you going to be in this picture before you stay on? I'll fix it for you.
It's, I mean, farm workers, 3 to 4 million nationwide. It's a hard number to.
Okay, are we? Let's begin, and we'll take questions. Let me just make a couple of comments initially. There are anywhere from 3 to 4 million farm workers in this country. Many of them are among the most vulnerable workers we have in this nation. Over the past several decades, laws have been enacted to protect them, to protect their health, protect their safety, protect their minimum wages, to ensure that they are treated with dignity and respect. But there are still problems. Now, let me make a very important distinction here. There are growers that are very, very responsible. And I want to commend this particular ranch, Peter Kupina, for the work he has done in providing facilities here for farm workers. This is after there was a fine and there was an wage and hour violation, and he, instead of doing what unfortunately some people do when the government steps in and getting very defensive, he actually invested $50,000 in making sure that that was a good facility for farm workers, a clean facility. But there are, unfortunately, some growers and some labor contractors who are not responsible, and we are cracking down on them. For the responsible ones, we want to provide encouragement, education, technical assistance, but with regards to the ones that are irresponsible, we're still taking advantage of this vulnerable population. We are going to come down very, very hard, and we have come down very, very hard. Maria Echeveste, who is the director of the Wage and Hour Division of the United States Department of Labor, is in charge of our work in this area. She and her division have been enormously aggressive recently, in the past 2 years, in making sure that, again, irresponsible growers and irresponsible farm labor contractors are brought to justice. There has been a substantial increase in back wages given to farm workers who have not been given adequate wages. There's been a substantial increase in our crackdown on, again, the kinds of facilities that are inadequate for farm workers, that are unsanitary, conditions that are unclean, conditions that no people should have to live in. The nation still has a great deal of work to do. We want to encourage the responsible farm workers. The responsible growers, they should not have to compete with the irresponsible. We want to encourage the responsible labor contractors. They should not have to compete with the irresponsible. But there is much, much work left to do. I spent the last while talking to some of the farm workers who have been working not only here, but also working up and down the West Coast. And they have told me about some of the problems they have had with other farm labor contractors, with other growers. They've told me stories of their laws, their rights being abused, of their not having the proper, not only the proper sanitary conditions and the proper transport and trucks to get to the fields, but also their pay being far less than was promised. They've told me about the difficulties they've had in even expressing concerns and complaints, that they have often been fired by farm labor contractors for even raising problems. That is simply impermissible in this country. These people are entitled to every protection of the law, and we're going to do everything we can to give them every protection of the law. I was distressed to learn just last week about the deaths of 3 farm workers in New York State. They were being transported. There were also many, many injuries. They were being transported in a truck it was inadequate, it was unsafe. A lot of them were crowded into a truck. These were the kinds of conditions that we talked about in this nation 3 decades ago. And because there was an accident, there were deaths and injuries. This should not go on in this country and must not go out in this country. And again, we are going to do what we need to do. We're going to hold irresponsible growers and farm labor contractors jointly liable. We're going to use the law in ways that we've used it with sweatshops in the garment industry. That is, we're using the hot goods provision, which means that produce that is harvested and that is sent into market with illegal working conditions will not be permitted to be shipped. And we're going to ensure through that mechanism that responsible growers don't have to compete with irresponsible growers, that growers have every incentive to put pressure on farm labor contractors to heed the law. Now let me thank the people here who have talked with me. Let me thank also the host who has enabled us to come here and tour the facility. Let me also turn it over to Maria Esteveste. Maria not only is the director of the Wage and Hour Division of the United States, but she has personal experience with many of the problems that she's going to be talking about.
Can you ask a question?
Well, let me,
I'll
if
just
you
take
might,
a minute.
just
Could you switch places with,
yeah.
thank you.
Let me go this way.
Maria, I'll even give you my...
Give me 2 points, which are the following. Number one, as the Secretary said, I do have personal experience. I grew up in the Clovis area. My parents were farm workers. I have firsthand knowledge about conditions in the fields, and so it's a tremendous pride to me that I'm in charge of a division that's dedicated to protecting workers, and we're going to keep trying to do that. But that brings me to my second point, which is the current budget debate in Congress and the proposed cuts will very much put at risk our ability to enforce laws in farm labor and sweatshops. Because to enforce laws, as the workers made clear, when they try to speak up and assert their rights, they're often at the mercy of unscrupulous employers. And so you need the government to provide the backbone and to help them assert their rights. But with these budget cuts, we may very well not be able to enforce laws in farm labor and in garment shops and janitors. And for us, it's a very, very troubling scene in Washington right now. So I'll leave this back to the Secretary.
Okay, let me, we lost part of the microphone just then. But let me second what Maria just said. We are beginning to get specific numbers about the cuts that the Republicans are proposing. Cuts in enforcement staffs, for occupational safety and health, for wage and hour, for all of the ways in which we are protecting workers, average workers, the working poor, people who cannot often protect themselves. There are major budget cuts being proposed, and it means that the very limited enforcement resources we have are going to be stretched even thinner. A lot of people are not going to be protected who now have even the barest forms of protection. If those budget cuts go through, this means a major step backwards for American workers, for the working poor, for working class people, for ordinary people working hard and trying to make a living in America. And let me take any questions that any of you have. I can't answer them, Maria.
The people who work for the Labor Department in the ballot, they say they need more staff for the grower and the contractor to comply with the laws. So, with less people, what the farm worker can expect?
Well, that's precisely the point. We're stretched so thin already. The Wage and Hour Division not only deals with farm workers, with sweatshops, with working conditions all over the country. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration deals with unsafe and often dangerous conditions in factories across the country. We have a pension and welfare benefits administration that tries to protect workers' pensions. We're trying to provide education and job training for workers. The Republicans want to cut all that. They're talking about cuts of 25 or 30 or 35% in this budget for next year. Now you tell me how American workers, you tell me how people who are vulnerable in this country, the working poor, average working Americans, working class Americans trying to work hard, you tell me how they are going to make it in America with these kinds of cuts. I have no idea.
Sir, my brother used to make $8 an hour 3 years ago, and now he's making $5.50. Why is that? We're doing the same thing.
All across the United States, although profits are going up and productivity is going up and top chief executive officers are making more money than they've ever made before and the stock market is booming, American workers are finding it harder and harder to make ends meet. Median wages last year continued to drop. They've dropped for 15 years. And a lot of the problem in this country has to do with changes in the organization of the economy, technology, international trade, the decline of the minimum wage. And adjusted for inflation, the minimum wage is heading to a 40-year low. Now, the President has proposed improvements in education and job training, increasing the minimum wage. The President has proposed improvements which would make it more difficult for employers to retaliate against workers who complain about working conditions, who want to form unions. But we are blocked, and we are blocked more vociferously than we have ever been blocked before. The first 2 years we made some progress in education and in job training. The Earned Income Tax Credit, a major step for working Americans. But this new crowd in Washington wants to take us back, wants to move backwards, enlarge the gap between the rich and everybody else. And this ought to be something that every American, not just people at the bottom of the heap, not just farm workers, sweatshop workers, not just the working poor, every American ought to be concerned about what's going on right now and ought to get the facts. It's a travesty that's happening.
What about a guest worker program? Why not just say, we need it, let's do it, have more supervision?
Well, we certainly don't need a guest worker program. There are plenty of farm workers right now. In fact, a lot of the farm workers who are
cut
here...
down on all the travesties?
No, quite the contrary. I mean, one of the reasons that the farm workers who are here legally, one of the reasons that they cannot speak out and they have such a difficult time lodging complaints and not being subjected to retaliation is that there's so many others who are willing to take their jobs and not complain. There's no shortage of farm workers here that I can
Most
see.
of them are illegal, sir.
And I'll tell you one other thing. We do have a program already in place, available for bringing in additional farm workers if there are labor shortages. That is already there on the books. I don't see why we have to have any additional programs.
And would you be willing to go after growers who hire contractors who are not
Yes, we have. Again, I want to make it very clear. There are responsible growers.
Right.
And this is not tar. I don't want to tar with a very broad brush here. In fact, I heard from these farm workers.
But this is the exception, and you know that.
Well, let me tell you what I heard from them. They tell me that some growers are responsible, some growers are irresponsible. They tell me that many of the farm labor contractors are irresponsible. And I asked them, are there ways in which, if we worked with the growers and put more pressure on the growers, that they could control some of the abuses of the farm labor contractors? The answer is yes. That's what we've heard around the country. We are putting more pressure on growers. We are enlisting growers in terms of cooperation. The responsible ones do want to cooperate. But we are going to impose some liability on the irresponsible growers who are not doing the job they should be doing, controlling the behavior of some of the farm labor contractors who are very, very difficult to police.
Mr. Secretary, what about the growers who say they're overregulated already? The great majority of them who say you're way too heavy-handed.
Well, I say to those growers, if there are major abuses in terms of hours and working conditions, if we still have farm workers who are in unsanitary conditions, trapped in a cycle of poverty in which they can't complain about conditions, if they're being abused, if they are being subjected to unsafe conditions that leads to deaths like we had last week in New York State, I say to growers, responsible growers, don't complain about regulation. You have nothing to fear from regulation. In fact, you should not have to compete with those growers that are cutting corners. What you want is more enforcement against those irresponsible growers.
But the small growers, like Mr. Kupina, who have worked very hard to establish what they do have, how does finding him $9,000 help his business operation?
Well, I'll tell you what he did, and I want to commend him for it, because he was fined $9,000. And at the time, there were not sanitary conditions here. And he turned around and invested $50,000 in creating a much more sanitary facility. We'll show you pictures of what was here before. He needed a little bit of encouragement, and I think that fine was a little bit of encouragement for him.
If I could just add on that point, that we're not interested in fining for fining's sake. We're interested in having results. So it's infinitely better to have Mr. Kupina make the investment because he finds it's better for his workers. He has a more stable workforce. They want to come back, as opposed to if we were only interested in fining, then that would not help workers and it wouldn't help the employers either. So we want to encourage employers to work with us. If we find a problem, work with us to resolve it.
And I want to, again, underscore that point because it has to do not only with wages and hours and working conditions for farm workers and sweatshop conditions we found in the garment industry. It has to do with occupational safety and health. Our interest is in results. It is not regulation for regulation's sake. It is not fines and penalties for fines and penalties' sake. We are working with employers to improve the conditions for ordinary workers. That's our goal.
After listening to the concerns of these farm workers, what assurances have you given them that what they've said makes a difference?
I have told them that we are intent on enforcing the law, that we are making progress. I can't give any guarantee. These problems have been with us for decades.
But just the fact that you're implementing the hot goods rules makes me feel good.
Well, I'm glad it makes you feel good. I'll tell you, the hot goods provision is a major step forward. We see it in the garment industry. We're seeing it here in fields by enlisting the help and support of the growers, of the ranchers, both responsible and also holding the irresponsible ones' feet to the fire. We are making some progress. Again, these are difficult problems, but they are not intractable.
Thank you very much.
Mr.
Maria, did you have something?
No, I was about to wrap it up.
Okay.
Did you
Thank you
encounter
very
a lot of roadblocks before building this?